start with Anne Kristen. Your work at Logos focuses on securing a human epistemic future. When AI systems output highly convincing but entirely unreliable information, it pretty much destroys our ability to agree on basic facts. Question here is, from a legal and rights perspective, how do you think we can protect our society's right to truth without sleepwalking into what could be a heavy-handed state censorship?
Thank you, and thank you all for being here and for the invitation. What a fantastic day, what a fantastic room, what a fantastic lunch, and what fantastic conversations we've had. At my table we got off the topic, but that's not new. I think that's probably my fault. Huge, difficult question. First of all, I don't have the answer, and I don't think anyone does. But I do want to share some ideas about how I think about this. First of all, I'm not sure we have a right to truth. In fact, I do think we have a right also to be told lies. And this is part of the reasons why this is so difficult. When we talk about a fundamental right to truth, I think what we're talking about is what I call epistemic rights. And this is work that I'm doing that comes from Matthias Risse at the Carl Ryan Center for Human Rights at Harvard Kennedy School. And so when we think about epistemic rights, we're thinking about the human rights we have that sort of concerns our intellectual faculties. So the right to expression, freedom of expression, but also freedom of thought, mental privacy, right to personality, and so on. So that's sort of where I conceptualize this. And so a lot of when we're talking about a right to truth, we're talking about actually rights that concern the dissemination and receiving information. From a legal point of view, I'm a professor of law, that's where I come into this. And so I break that into three spheres, and I see it as a Venn diagram in order to try and make sense of this from a regulatory point of view. So the first one is our right to access to information. And that's where it's like, what is this information? Is it good? Is it bad? High quality? And access often is regulated by things like, do I have the cognitive bandwidth to actually get this information? What is the funding of the source of the information? We know there's a problem with independence of media. Those are things that regulate that. So I think right to truth, right to good information. How do I get access to that? That's a positive and negative right. The second one is the access to understand the information. It doesn't matter if you tell me something really great if I'm like completely clueless what you mean, which is often the case when it comes to scientific technicality, for example, in my case. That's where it gets really interesting in terms of regulation, because that's where we talk about things like dark patterns and deceptive designs. I don't know how many of you know about that, probably all of you. I've done quite a lot of work on this. This is what we're thinking about when you have, for example, a web page or some sort of interaction with an online site, and it gets updated and tailored bespokely to you in real time, based on hidden psychometric profiling, based on data points you know or don't know you're giving to that profiling algorithm. That could include galvanic information, so basically your body temperature, which will then be interpreted to how you feel, and therefore you feel a certain way, you're more likely to behave a certain way. So that kind of use, I think, is really interesting. And it goes into AI literacy, labeling of information. Again, showing somebody's data provenance or where it comes from doesn't mean it's true, doesn't mean it's genuine, but that's what we're talking about. And then the third category is right not to be given information. And this is the one we never talk about. All the noise, the cognitive overload, the bombardment of things, the things that are being streamed our direction. I don't want to hear a lot of nonsense, for example, that takes away my ability to access good information. So I think that's the sort of starting point to think about that, and to think that these things are social and relational. So truth comes from, I think, what we as collectively gathered through scientific inquiry and other things to decide what is true. It's not an opinion thing, but it's still something that we have collectively decided and it evolves. How do we safeguard those methods to do so is a big question.
Thank you very much. And speaking about infrastructure, one thing we see, especially on social media, is the labeling of deepfake to say, yes, this has been verified to be deepfake, or that information is misinformation, it's wrong. But this is quite a reactive measure that I think we are deploying. What is our ideas on being a solution towards more proactivity to solve this problem or to mitigate this problem?
So, again, complex question, right? But you can have three ways to look at it. You can say mis and disinformation in terms of I'm trying to tell you politically something to do. So I'm saying, you told me you hate, bananas, and I'm a banana person, and I think, oh my gosh, you're a horrible person, that's not true. That would be, I need a label to tell me, fact checking, you said it or not. Then we have deepfake that's done to harm somebody. And there's one called intimate image abuse, for example. Fake pornography, that sort of thing. That has a different kind of harm than trying to affect my political opinion. It's about harming you personally. That's a different kind of criminal regulation. But then we have the really difficult ones, which is about, okay, what are we even talking about? AI generated. How much? If I change the color of your suit, should that be labeled or not? How detailed do we get? The example, I do a lot of work on AI and copyright. And one of the examples I'm using in my upcoming report is Maria Callas, the film. Some of you might have seen. Angelina Jolie plays Maria Callas. I think she does a wonderful job. I think the film lacks a little bit of a story. In it is a wonderful performance. In it, what they've done is they've taken Maria Callas' voice, then they've taken Angelina Jolie's voice, then they've taken an AI-generated voice and merged those three together. Now, how do we label that? And I think that's where this gets really difficult.
Thank you very much. We follow up also on another areas, and I think all questions are quite complex and difficult. We can appreciate that, but they are coming quite fast, and the problem is also probably getting bigger. But one aspect on liability, who will be responsible? Do we look at the developer, the deployer of the technology, the user when something goes wrong, especially when there can be financial loss or worse?
Somebody asked me this over lunch, I can't remember. Yeah, we had that wonderful conversation. And I said, well, as a good lawyer, there's only one answer, it depends. And so, it depends. We can have lots of legal, deep questions about it. But what we will find is most likely we'll look at who had some sort of controlling responsibility, who made some decision about this. And then we will see who actually has any money. And that's what the courts will do. So they will most likely look at who can get, who can be assigned responsibility that can pay for this harm. So it's a two-pronged answer. Unfortunately, the real answer though is we don't know often, and therefore those who are harmed or subjected to that have very little recourse in law as it stands.
Thank you very much. Another theme or angle to look at this is the ethical complications of things, and that's other matters to also consider and think about. Professor Harcourt with us today, and thank you for joining. Looking at this through your ethical lenses and your research, truth has traditionally been tied to human intent. And conscious agency. The problem is that with AI, with large language models, they generate convincing falsehood. There is no conscious liar behind it. There's no human intentionally lying. It's machine text. So the question here that I would like to ask you, how does this shift from a human deception to automated and systemic and reliable information change how we assign moral responsibility?
Can I, before trying to answer that question, thank you, before trying to answer that question, can I go a couple of steps back? Right to your first question to Anne-Christine, which is, I agree with her that there's no generalised right not to be lied to, or no generalised right not to be misled. So there are rights not to be lied to in specific contexts. For example, as a consumer, I have a right not to be misled by what it says on a drug that I'm prescribed. It says it's passed certain safety tests when really it hasn't. Or I've got a right not to be misled about whether a food that I buy. And there are many other specific contexts in which I do have a right not to be misinformed. But there are many, many contexts in which I think you can be disadvantaged by being misinformed, but it's just life, right? There's no right of mine that's being violated. And we would also get ourselves into a terrible legal and moral mess if we tried to legislate some generalised right not to be misled. The second thing I want to say, which is another sort of context-setting remark, is that even though AI has created an atmosphere of public mistrust in the information that's available digitally, it's not as if we are just exiting a golden age in which everybody agreed about everything. Okay? I mean, so it's true that if you want to find out the atomic weight of gold, you can look it up somewhere and you won't find 5 different opinions about it. And there is a certain kind of fantastical unreliability that, forgive me if I'm raising a controversial issue, but about climate change or vaccines, where things that are manifestly untrue get put out online, and then we have deep fakes and so forth. But one reason why, and I completely agree that we don't want to enter into a period of state censorship where, in the name of ensuring reliable sources of information, we create a single sort of national controller for truth. It's so important to have plural sources of reliable information, but that's because people disagree about what the truth is. Why do you think we have both the Guardian and the Telegraph? Well, because they'll give you different numbers about how many people there were at the demonstration. It'll give you different information about who was killed in what civil war in what country. And these are factual questions, these are not matters of opinion. So that the fact that your valid point that we have to have plural sources of information actually is a good way of foregrounding the fact that there was no golden age of agreement on hard facts. The third thing I want to say, and I'm not really answering your question because I don't know that it has an answer, but I'll come round to it in a minute. Some of you will have read recently about the Ernst & Young Canada report that had to be binned because it was so full of misinformation. Well, who discovered that it was full of misinformation? The answer is AI. So AI creates the problem. It may also help us to create the solution. I mean, I'm not a big optimist about AI, but there's AI and then there's AI. It can do more than one thing. So we shouldn't overlook the fact that AI might help us out of here, not just be to blame. The reason I'm trying to avoid answering your question about, well, your question was, look, AI may or may not be an agent, but it's certainly not a human agent, so when it misleads us, whose fault is it? I'm very firmly of the opinion that AI is not a life form, not a form of minded life at all comparable to ourselves, but even if it were, I think that the basic answer to your question lies in Anne-Christine's field, because it's a question about liability. And that's, in a way, that who is liable for misinformation spreading in a dangerous fashion is ultimately going to be a legal question. And I think it's a question that will be settled not just, as you rightly say, by who's got the money, right? Who's capable of paying damages, but I don't think there's necessarily a truth that's out there to discover about who is really liable. It'll be a matter of political and social negotiation as to whom we assign reliability to. Have a microphone.
Thank you very much. A follow-up question to yourself and the panel. It's about trustworthiness. A lot of research happened in this area, and it's sometimes we also want to hear good thoughts around whether it's a good idea to build public trust in AI in general, compared to having maybe a more realistic goal to say we should be fostering warranted trustworthiness, in the sense that we should train citizens to know when to verify. How do we train people how to verify? What are our chances in encouraging more people to verify? How can we build that culture?
Is that a question to me?
So we can start with you, please.
I'll say very briefly, super important question. I mean, one of the horrible things about AI, and indeed the drive towards digitizing the human record that started well before advanced AI came on the scene, is that people, particularly young people, are encouraged to think that data is identical with digitally available data, and it's not. I work in an institution, and 2 floors down from my office there's a library full of books, and you remember those things? They're on paper, right? And we'll never have enough money to digitize all that stuff. When I first started working at UKRI, we were digitization mad, and we thought, let's try and digitize all the collections that we have, the museum collections in the British Isles. And we were very envious of the fact that the Germans that we were collaborating with, the government set aside money to digitize the contents of one museum, the Natural History Museum, and that was 700 million euros, and that was 6 years ago. We're never going to do it. So there's a whole lot of data that's never going to be available online. The other super important concept in the background of your question is this concept of epistemic deference, or epistemic deference or cognitive atrophy. So nurturing the soft infrastructures, the soft human infrastructures which give people both the critical distance to question what they find online, and which give them the intellectual capacities to find out whether what they see online is true or not, is, I think, a really civilizationally important issue for us. And these infrastructures are really hard to create because they grow up slowly over time, and they're really easy to destroy. So don't say, and what's your magic wand solution for how we nurture these things? I don't know, but we should do our best to, in any school, any institution of higher learning, in institutions like this, ensuring that there are people who are schooled in preserving their critical distance from information that they find out there online is highly, highly important. And that's different from keeping humans in the loop, because if you've got a human who defers to the bot, you may as well have 2 bots.
Yeah, I think I'm from Sustainability West Midlands. Of course, I'm going to come at this from a sustainability angle. We represent over 200 members, cross-sector members, including Aston Uni, innovators, manufacturers, CICs. They're all using AI in different ways and have different levels of trust in it. But I think when we think about sustainability and climate change, there's quite a lot of examples that I think have undermined that trust. So our members are rightly concerned about the environmental impact of data centres, and there's published information on that, whether that's energy, water use, raw materials. But recent analysis by various organisations has shown that the government have potentially underplayed the level of carbon emissions associated with data centres. Organisations applying for planning are underplaying their carbon impact, so I think that plays into the trust piece. And then of course you've got the information that's coming out from AI, and I thought it would be fun to ask ChatGPT what it had said on climate change before, which hadn't been truthful. And it bravely told me all sorts of things, but one thing was underplaying the urgency of the need to act on climate change, overplaying the focus on individual action as opposed to the need for systemic change. And again, I think for organisations that are concerned about sustainability, when you have to question the truth that is coming out around the technology itself and the answers it's giving you, it's hard to rebuild that. So not the answer, sorry, the challenges, I think.
Sure, or comment and perhaps draw it a little bit differently. I think one of the key questions we have, which was already mentioned, is like, what is the access to data? And we see this particularly when it comes to probabilistic large language models, where it's like volume matters. So to correct a data set of outcome, when everything in the data set says, points you in the wrong direction, is incredibly hard. We see this with credit scores in America, for example, how incredibly difficult it is for Americans to get correct credit scores, because if you have 10 data points that says something that's incorrect, you can't do it. My good colleague, Professor Lorna Waddington at Leeds University, is a historian. She talks a lot about this. She is an expert on genocide and the Third Reich and Nazi Germany. And she loves large language models. She's a gung-ho AI convert. And she loves to use them, but she also sees how much they, in her view, rewrites history by making people drop out. That sort of silent censorship in that sense, which is not blatant saying we don't want this, but suddenly certain things don't appear. Certain soldiers can't be generated, certain things can't be mentioned. And she loves the Chinese models, because the Chinese models will say, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm not allowed to talk about this. While the Western model says, oh, I didn't understand the technical specification. So there's also something about what is it we understand when we use these systems. The final point I make is, I'm wondering, and this is me speculating wildly with all of you, is when we started to get social media and all the nonsense there, we had a fantastic, huge category of people called content moderators that were employed. Psychologically harmed, but employed. Are we going to have the same here with like checking, AI for missing this? What do you think?
I will pass the question to our audience. I was one of those at a smaller scale, not with a social media company, but it's hectic work, and I wonder what we will do. My next question is built upon a personal experience very recently with elections. Taking a shortcut, wanted to compare it and save time, checking who's running in my local area to go and vote and what information can Gemini give me, and for other models as well. And I just noticed there were only 2 candidates for me to select from, and I thought, this can't be right. Just from the door, I got 3 different papers, and I was looking for more. Of course, the information was wrong. 3 more prompts, and Gemini insisted that this is the number, and the other one dropped out, the 4th one did hallucinating, made up full stories. Then I went to my old friend Google outside Gemini just to check a government website, take a name, challenge Gemini on a name just to get an apology, and follow that up with full accurate information. It makes me think, but the information is there. Why was that story made up? So therefore, the last theme which I wanted to ask Anna, it's not far from operational realities. You work directly with local authorities, the NHS, regional supply chains across the West Midlands, and that's a complex environment. If regional public services rely on unverified AI metrics, and for example, for carbon reporting, considering what you do at work, what are the real world risks that could affect public safety, community trust, and all other things?
Yeah, thank you. I think I sort of touched on this already around, the information that is coming out of AI platforms, and I think one of the biggest concerns we have, if you're looking at public service design, whether that's transport systems, healthcare, it's how fit for purpose they are here and now, but of course thinking about being fit for the future as well. If AI is telling us, we're underplaying the risks of future climate, heat waves, flooding and so on, we've got to have absolutely accurate data to feed into the design of infrastructure. And I think to your point around the misinformation that comes out of AI, it's so convincing, isn't it? And I think about the organisations that I know are using it. They respond to the language, it talks to their drivers, and what works for a manufacturer, for example, is going to be very different from a professional services organisation. But AI has an ability to talk to you in a language that's very convincing. It has an ability to show you imagery, videos that are incredibly convincing. So I think it goes back to the point that you've got to have that human intelligence to review for facts, sense check, and that future proofing as well.
Just to follow up on this bit, so when it comes to resources needed, because verification is very important, do you already see, or to get a comment on how what might be we describe as an elite organization, someone who's fortunate to have access to data set that can be verified, or a mechanism to verify data, compared to public services or small companies where this is not the case due to cost. To share an example, how would this have an impact on the equity divide, on qualities, on how we trust business processes?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, inequality is a massive issue in the West Midlands, whether it's on a household level, you know, life expectancy varies massively across the region, whether it's between our more urban areas like Birmingham, Wolverhampton, Coventry, and our more rural areas. So we've got massive inequality linked to a whole range of issues. But I do think that data inequality feeds into that, and you know, the ability, for example, for our large councils, Birmingham I think is one of the largest in Europe still, just about, you know, and their ability to access good quality data versus a very local council. And it's almost a self-perpetuating circle, I think. You know, the larger organisations that have got the budget to spend on good quality data, that have got the in-house AI teams, potentially going to then be more successful, attract more funding, whereas the smaller, more local councils, more local healthcare organisations or businesses, less so. So it feels like it has the potential to increase that inequality. Obviously there are solutions around sharing of data, working more collaboratively, in recognition of that, but I do think it is a very real issue given the inequality we already have.
Any other comments?
Well, I was just going to ask you, Anna, what you thought. I mean, given what you said at the beginning about the environmental impact of data centres, if we paid due attention to that impact, can you foresee a future in which data use has to be rationed? In which case, on what basis would you do that to avoid some of the inequalities you're talking about?
I think the solutions are there for sustainable data centres, whether that's renewable energy supply, whether that's capture of the heat that's produced to go on and heat other buildings. I think the solutions are there. I think it's the pace of growth that is the challenge. I did read a scary fact that I think the estimate is that by 2035 AI will be responsible for 20% of our carbon emissions in the UK, so it's a huge proportion. Data rationing?
I mean, data rationing, but not by price, I mean, is what I was thinking about.
I can't see that happening.
Neither can I, which is why I asked the question.
No. I'd like to think that we can innovate and we can, you know, look at the sustainability of the centres themselves.
Okay.
Great question.
Thank you very much. Our audience to get ready for their interventions, but first one more question related to how we can build towards solutions to collaboration. So a question to the panel, all the panel. Given our Franco-British context today, how can the distinct policy approaches from France and the UK complement each other to our current truth?
I think this is a challenging one, obviously. Coming from a law perspective, of course, we're two different legal systems, so that's already starting. But I do think these kinds of events are the start of that. I think we all know, from the UK perspective, we're in a different political sort of conversation than we were just a few months ago in terms of our relationship with Europe and our European partners. And with that, of course, France is the first, the first and closest European partner. I would like to follow up on some of the suggestions made at my table, which has to do about closer cooperation between research milieux. So what was said about AI and the scientific cooperation, I think that's a starting point.
Yeah, I think it's, there's no reason why when Laura described the two different regimes earlier in the day, I think there's no reason why there should not be complementarity between the two, because one is more legislation focused and the British one is not. It would be easier to, given that, it would be easier to import the British way of doing things into France than to go the other way, because I can't see the British government preparing something like the AI Safety Act in the EU in a hurry. I think another area in which we might make some progress, perhaps combining the two, is if the insurance market, professional indemnity insurance against AI risk develops, because that's something that can only develop properly if liability is properly assigned, going back to what we were saying earlier, but it also, because people don't want to pay excessive insurance premiums, encourages non-mandatory good behaviour of the kind that the British government is into in its emphasis on AI safety.
Yeah, I think one reflection from me, it's a great day bringing together, various sectors and experts, I would say. But I think one of the conversations that has come up a lot is how we engage those that aren't experts in this. We talk about it often around sustainability-based stealth. How do we kind of spread the word, but with people sort of outside the sector? So I wonder if there is a role for the network to bring in wider organisations where this isn't their core activity, but they would really benefit from the expertise both here and in France.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to open the floor for questions from the audience. I can pass the mic.
Thanks for the great talks. This one's for Anne. What do you think is going to take before rules and regulations that typically apply to humans now start to precipitate onto autonomous agents? Thinking of circumstances like agents being able to walk around and drive, but also to commit acts of crime and felonies. What do you think that boundary is going to look like, whereas society starts to see a need to regulate and treat agents a bit more like humans?
I have a wonderful one here. So we have been, in the legal academic community, we've been talking about this for the last 10 years. And we call what is called the attribution gap, or so there's been talk about this, where people start to say, oh, should we have a robot in jail? Like commits murder, goes rogue. Or the flip side, should we have a robot judge? Which I think is really interesting. And in both of those cases, the sort of literature, after much ado, has sort of landed on we won't, because we want to connect with other human beings, and we want punishment to happen to other beings, human beings. So we no longer do, for example, trials of pigs or whatever we did in the medieval age, right? So chances are we won't, I don't think. Also because this is about resources, right? Who goes to court and not. So it comes back to the question about who's liable, and how liable am I then for how the computer or whatever it is, the robot that goes rogue. Is it the owner, is it the clone, is it the person who provides the electricity for it? That is the question. We are tempted, and there will be people in this room who are much better to talk about this, including Edward, about like this idea of treating AI and robots as humans, you know, and we like to do that, but I think we need to be very careful not to. And that's where I get into his area in terms of the grey ethical bit of, for example, mental health bots, or, you know, when you bring back your grieving dead, you know, your dead parents and you engage with them, is that good for ethicals or not? But the short answer is, I can't see it for the moment. I might be wrong, but I don't think so.
You want to say anything about that? Because I brought you in there.
No, thank you.
Sorry.
Yes, I mean, I think my basic response to your question is that treating artificial systems as legal persons is a get out of jail free card for AI, for big tech. So I'm against it. If you force me to think a little further down the track, if agentic AI is capable of, say, having a bank account with its own money in the account that it's earned in some way, it might be possible to devise a civil liability system for in which AI was treated, in which we took a step closer to treating artificial systems as legal persons. I don't think we could ever make them criminally liable, because the whole point of criminal liability is you make something else suffer, and I don't think artificial systems can suffer. But even if we had the idea of an artificial system that had money in the bank, I still think we would probably, the way we would probably go in thinking about liability is, okay, the tech developer takes the money that it owes to the person harmed from that bank account or something, rather than from its own bank account. I just can't see it, and I don't think it would be a good thing. Would you like to?
Thank you. Not my area of expertise.
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I think that was a really inspiring and hopeful panel, and thank you to the French residents and to Aston for hosting us all today. I think it's been really inspiring. My name is Margareta, I work for Dell Technologies, and I just wanted to ask around sovereignty and data sovereignty, given that we're here in the French residence, and this is a unique moment where we've got two nations coming together to talk about AI and how we build capability together and strengthen the two nations together. So very keen, just interested to understand what your attitudes are around data sovereignty, security, particularly in this current geopolitical landscape right now and how uncertain it is. We'd love to see greater unity around sovereignty across Europe and the UK, but really between France and the UK, we'd be really interested to get your thoughts.
Okay, so my two other panelists have passed it on. I had lots of views, but I'm going to try to be short so we don't sit here all night. We had a great deep conversation about this right now. In starting point, I think that the idea of digital and AI sovereignty is a good thing. Like, that's what I think to start off. I think our dependence on US tech is not good for the US. I don't think it's good for us. I think the Eurostack project that some of you might know on the continent is very interesting, of trying to build a sovereignty there. I think what the UK has announced that it wants to do with the AI Sovereignty Fund, and I think Innovation UK is doing something called Frontier AI and so on and so forth, slightly different of trying to say how can we get AI companies in this country to scale and have actually have viability, which means something else than just being bought by the Americans. That's how I understand it, and that it's probably much more complicated than that. I don't know how we do this. I think there is a market incentive for us to have AI sovereignty, but I also think it's become a geopolitical imperative for us to do so. What we mean by this is different to different people, even what sovereignty means. Are we talking data sovereignty? Are we talking system sovereignty? Are we talking compute power? and how vulnerable are we. I think at least 1/3 of people in this room will be so better placed than me to talk about the cybersecurity aspects of this conversation, but I think this is where we as sort of consumer protection regulators or AI regulators need to get closer to the cybersecurity community. I think we in the UK should get closer to France and Europe. But how to do that and still remember that the US are our allies and we do depend on it, and so will the US. I don't know. 2 days ago, and I'll end on this, 2 days ago I was down at the bottom of the street at the Norwegian embassy, and they were talking about Norway buying some of those big fancy military boats. I think a frigate, but my military boat knowledge is limited. And they were doing it and saying, we're not going to buy from the US because we want sovereignty, so we're going to go to the UK. Great, until of course we find that every computer system on that boat is American. And I think this is a good illustration of how difficult this is. So with great difficulty and with great urgency, we need to tackle this head on.
Thank you very much. We do have one more question we can take.
Yes, hello, and thank you so much for a fantastic panel, lots of takeaways. I wanted to ask each of you to share with us what is the big thing we should be thinking about in the next 3 months?
Thanks a lot. Well, often when I'm asked a question like that, I try to say not what I really think is most important, but what I think other people will have left unsaid. And so in general, I say the corruption of the historical record and how we can secure that against corruption by deep fakes and other AI interference. But actually, because of the focus on truth in this panel, we covered that pretty well, so that answer won't do. What shall I say instead? I think thinking carefully, yes, it's cognitive atrophy. How do we deal with that? And I think part of the solution is AI driven, so AI that asks us a question rather than telling us the answer. But part of the answer is what I was talking about in an earlier round of questions, which is how do we nurture the soft human infrastructures that give us a critical distance and enable us to question what AI tells us. I think that's a very urgent problem, but a very difficult one.
Thank you. So our mission as an organisation is to try and get climate change adaptation and resilience the same focus as climate mitigation has now. So we're all looking at how we can bring down emissions associated with our activities as organisations and at home as well. But I don't think there is enough focus on improving our resilience to the future. So I would encourage everybody in the next 3 months to give that some thought. How will that affect your organisation, your supply chain, your customers? And what can you do to address that? And obviously there's a role for AI in that for all of us as well.
And I'm going to go all American on us and say, we have a challenge, let's make it an opportunity. We have a political gridlock at the moment in this country. Nothing's going to happen, I don't think. Again, I might be wrong, but as we know with our current Labour Party situation, which of course means that this is the time to think that whatever comes out of that, to be ready with the great proposals for what we want the next person, even if it's Starmer, to do, and not just react, because somebody's going to come in wanting a new plan. And so I think for the theme of today as well about the British Franco cooperation, this is the time to come together and say this is what we want that partnership to look like, and be ready, because in September, when Parliament comes back, they will say what next.
Thank you very much. We agree time for more action. Thank you for this opportunity. I would like to pass our sincere thanks to the panel for the discussion and important input.